Boston was one of the most important cities in colonial America. It had this very, very unique culture, and it was a center of commerce. It had critically important political and religious effects on the entire colonial system in North America. Today, every major city has its own unique culture. New York City, Chicago, LA, they have their own feel to them. But that concept is even more true in the 18th century colonial America system. Each one of the cities like New York and Boston and Philadelphia and say Charleston, they all have very, very different cultures. You'll find the same kind of hotels and restaurants nationwide that makes some of our cities feel very similar to each other. But in the 18th century, that wasn't true. In those cities, you'll have different kinds of language, very different dialects, different clothing, different food, even different money in these different cities. So you can imagine in colonial America, you would really know you were in Boston if you were in Boston. Now, Boston has a very long history. It isn't where the colonists first came over, say the Puritans coming to Massachusetts in 1620, but by 1630, that's when Boston starts out. And they like it because it's got a great port, a harbor that you can bring ships into, and it's got a wonderful water supply. So people started to populate Boston fairly rapidly. The culture of Boston in the 18th century comes out of the Puritans that arrive in Massachusetts in the 17th century. And these Puritans are coming over from the area of Great Britain called East Anglia. They have a very, very specific cultural identity. The clothing, the speech patterns, and the food ways that are coming in through these Puritans. Now, this affects 17th century Boston, but that continues to be very, very true for 18th century Boston and is still true to a small extent today. We all know Boston because of some of the major political events that happen in the late 18th century that become part of the founding of the United States. We have these important things like the Boston Massacre and the Boston Tea Party and the Battle of Bunker Hill. Boston is at the center of these events. This is the political sort of heartbeat of the late 18th century in early America. One of the most distinguishing features of this area are the foodways. What kind of food are people in Boston eating? Or specifically, if you were from someplace else and you were eating in Boston, what pops out as completely different than any place else? The most obvious answer here are baked beans. Boston baked beans. Those are so famous in the 19th century and they're still famous today. Now, baked beans have this very, very hard to decipher history. We know them to be incredibly important and very identified with Boston in the 19th century. Now, this term baked beans is very, very common for the 1830s and after that. It seems to be highly identified with that. But as we push back further and we try to understand the roots of baked beans, we have to get a little bit more creative to understand where this term is coming from. We find a few references to it in, say, 1812 or 1817, and one single reference that goes back to 1803. But as we look back further, and specifically into the 18th century, we can't look through the murky lens of research and find exactly what we're looking for. We can't find the roots of baked beans unless we dig a little deeper and understand the culture of these East Anglians and these Puritans as they're coming to Massachusetts. So this set of people with their specific religious views and their cultural ways, they are very plain in their ideas about clothing and about food. They are not people that are expecting rich dishes, heavy meat dishes, and lots of sweets or anything like that. They think that that's actually bad for your moral health as well as your physical health. So they're interested in plain dishes that aren't very spicy. And one of the most popular dishes in this East Anglian area in the 16th and 17th century is peas pudding. And we've done peas pudding on the channel before. And you take these peas, like split peas, yellow peas, green peas, and you'll boil them in a bag. And you'll boil them for several hours. You'll open it up, you'll add some butter, you'll close it back up, you'll boil it again, and then you turn these peas out. And they're mushy and gooey, a very plain dish. And some people in this time period, that's all they were eating. That was the main dish they were living upon. Now, if we think about what's going on here with these peas, it turns out that peas and beans are very similar. They're pulses. The peas that they're probably talking about in a lot of these peas puddings are field peas, basically a kind of bean. Think pinto bean. Now, what about the cooking method? There's a lot of change between peas pudding, which is boiled in a bag, and a baked bean dish, which we basically cover up these beans with water and we bake them for a long period of time, and they turn out completely differently. Well, in the 18th century, we have a wonderful transition going on in puddings themselves between boiled puddings and then a baked pudding, where we take the similar kind of ingredient and we bake it in a pan. And we see this is almost exactly the same transition if we take this very, very popular dish of peas pudding in the 17th century and we try to bake it. It turns into a baked bean kind of dish. And the peas turned into a little bit more like a standard bean that we would use today. And the cooking method changes as well. So we see exactly where these Boston baked beans came from. Just a shift in a cooking style and a slight shift of ingredients.
You cannot talk about Boston food without talking about Boston baked beans. Now, this is kind of a difficult subject to research. There are a lot of myths out there. There are a lot of maybe half-truths, and there's a ton of speculation. So what we've done for this episode is just try to get to the bare bones. We've got a really simple recipe here that we're going to show you. We're not going to add anything that might have been. We're just going really straightforward. This recipe comes from Lydia Childs' The Frugal Housewife in 1830. And it's a really great cookbook. It's just good bare bones cooking. And what's interesting about this particular cookbook is after Amelia Simmons' American Cookery, this is the first truly American cookbook. And it's from Boston. She's from Boston. And she starts off this recipe by saying, this is a simple dish. Not many people make it well. This is exactly the right way to do it. Beans and peas. Baked beans are a very simple dish, yet few cook them well. They should be put in cold water and hung over the fire the night before they are baked. In the morning, they should be put in a colander and rinsed 2 or 3 times, then again placed in a kettle with the pork you intend to bake, covered with water and kept scalding hot an hour or more. A pound of pork is quite enough for a quart of beans, and it is a large dinner for a common family. The rind of the pork should be slashed. Pieces of pork, alternately fat and lean, are the most suitable. The cheeks are the best. A little pepper sprinkled among the beans when they are placed in the bean pot will render them less unhealthy. They should be just covered with water when put into the oven, and the pork should be sunk a little below the surface of the beans. Bake 3 or 4 hours. For this recipe, we've got to, in a modern sense, we've got to tweak the recipe just a little bit because not many people have a fireplace in their home that they're going to hang these beans up in. And we also don't need to put them in scalding hot water with the pork for an hour because our beans are going to be processed in a different way from the beginning. So we're going to soak our beans, or we're going to use a pressure cooker or something like that in a modern sense to get those beans ready. After the beans are ready to go, the recipe is pretty much verbatim. You're just going to take your beans, you're going to put them into your pot, you're going to put it in there with pork. Now, most of the pork that we're going to be using doesn't have as much fat or rind like what she's talking about here. I just am planning to take my pork, use as much of the fat as I can because fat's flavor and you want that in there, but I'm going to cube it up and mix it in with the beans. At that point, we're just going to salt, pepper, and we're going to fill this up with water. Now, the idea is to have the beans over the pork. We don't want pork sticking up out of the water. So the pork's going to be below the last layer of beans, and the beans are going to be just covered with water. For any of you out there who have not worked with beans before, there's a process of getting your beans ready to go. And you can look this up in several places and get different tricks, but essentially you want to soak your beans overnight, change the water once or twice, and what's happening there is we're changing the texture of the beans and kind of getting them to open up, swell a little bit. And also there's a toxicity in those beans that you want to change the water and get rid of that toxicity. Let's talk about beans really quickly. So in the time period, there's an adjustment that's happening. We've got English people that are used to eating peas, and they're in this new area where they're still eating peas. But there's also a transition that happens somewhere between the early 18th century and the early 19th century, where we're seeing a crossover to folks saying, I'm going to use beans because beans, we're learning about beans here in this new world. It gets more complex than that too, because folks in this time period are interchanging peas and beans, because we're not necessarily talking about green garden split peas. We're talking about all sorts of varieties of beans. So something even like a black-eyed pea is a bean in the time period when people are talking about it. And they don't necessarily designate when they're talking about them in recipes. Right now we have an example right here of this is what we would call field peas. There's also what we're using today, which are great northern or navy beans or white beans, whatever you call them from wherever you grew up. These were available in the time period. Now, in a modern sense, you can go wild. You can use any bean that you want to. A really great bean to use in baked beans is a black bean. They're perfect for this recipe. So in a modern sense, go wild, have some fun. In a period sense, it's very convoluted, but it's either a field pea or a bean. Our beans are ready to bake. The water is in there. The water is just above the top layer of beans. The pork is submerged underneath the beans. Now, if you're using a ceramic bean pot like this, you're gonna wanna take a little bit of butter and go around the rim, and then put your lid on so it doesn't stick. When I've baked beans before, I've tried it at several different temperatures, and I've tried it for different time lengths. You will look this up on the internet or in other books, and they're gonna tell you 3 or 4 hours, and that's nonsense. You wanna bake beans for a long time. This is not a quick game. This is 300 degrees, 6 hours easy, even longer. Our beans are finished. These look a little bit different than I thought they would. A lot of modern baked beans recipes will tell you to add liquid as you go. This recipe didn't say anything about that. I did cook it longer than the recipe called for. So I don't know, when you're playing with it at home, if you decide that it seems a little bit dry, go ahead and add some liquid. If you want to make it exactly like she says in the cookbook, it's a 3 to 4 hour bake. But I certainly don't think that's enough time for baked beans. Let's give it a try. Yeah, that's really good. It doesn't taste, the texture is not dry at all. It's really good. This is in no way a modern baked beans recipe. It's a lot different in taste, but I think you're gonna love it. I know John's gonna love it.
Boston was one of the biggest commercial centers in North America in the 18th century. It had this great harbor that you could bring ships into, and there are different speakers that are talking in the time period about going into Boston Harbor, and there was 100 ships waiting to be unloaded. And we even think about, the Boston Tea Party. And the reason why the Boston Tea Party is happening there is because tea is coming in, large quantities of tea, multiple ships coming in, and they're just filled with tea. This area is got a lot of shipping coming into it and a lot of shipping coming out of it. It is a very important commercial center. The idea of commerce here is part of the culture of the Puritans as they came over. Most of the Puritans weren't really big farmers. They really had this idea of having a lot of middle class, a lot of merchants, and people that would buy and sell things. And that's really kind of one of the specialties for Boston. It was such a huge shipping center. All these items were coming into Boston, and lots of items were being shipped out of Boston, especially back to Great Britain. Another characteristic that this region is known for is frugality. They like to save money, they like to make money, and if there's ever a time when there's a product that might sell for a better price and they could use a cheaper version for themselves, they would do that. And the perfect example here is wheat and corn. Wheat isn't easy to grow in Massachusetts in the 18th century. Corn is much easier to grow, and wheat is very, very expensive. So rather than make their bread or other recipes out of wheat, which they would much rather, if they did grow it, they would much rather export it and make money from it, they would use corn in these recipes. An example of this wheat to corn substitution is bread. Bread is not easy to make with something that's just corn. Corn by itself without the gluten does not form up, it just crumbles and it has a different texture and it doesn't have a great flavor all by itself. So there's modifications that people are doing in the 18th century, specifically adding wheat or even better in this case rye, which grows more easily in this region. And so a classic regional bread would be what they would call Ryan Indian bread, which means rye and Indian cornmeal bread. And this bread is so simple. It doesn't have the same kind of fluffy texture that our white or even brown bread would have. This bread can have a tough texture, it's very flavorful, it's very rich, and it is really kind of the perfect bread to put on this Puritan plate for a Boston feast. Corn can also be used for this amazing dessert that's so famous for New England and the Boston area.
A very popular New England and Boston dish in the time period was Indian pudding. It's still popular today, but you see it a lot in the 18th and early 19th centuries, and that is a really simple way to take cornmeal and turn it into something special. Now, cornmeal, this is an ingredient that people used for all sorts of purposes. One of them, it's just a kind of a very essential survival food, especially during the Revolutionary War. We see a lot of soldiers that are eating hasty pudding. And in that sense, it's nothing special. There's nothing special about it. In fact, you kind of lament when you need to eat hasty pudding. But this is a way to take that idea of a dish and elevate it and make it something special. It shows up a few times in Amelia Simmons' American Cookery. Why else would a simple dish like this show up in Amelia Simmons' cookbook 3 different times if it wasn't super popular and super sought after? Indian puddings. Number 2, 3 pints scalded milk to 1 pint cornmeal, salted. Cool, add 2 eggs, 4 ounces of butter, sugar or molasses, and spice. It will require 2.5 hours baking. This is a super simple recipe and it is very tasty. What we're gonna do is we're gonna get our milk in our pan and get it rolling. When it starts to roll, and we're gonna stir it the whole time because we don't want anything to burn, we're gonna add our cornmeal. And at that point, it won't take long for it to become the right consistency. That cornmeal is kind of gonna swallow up all that milk and absorb it. Then we're gonna take it out and let it cool. At that point, we're going to add our butter right before it gets all the way cool because we want that butter to melt and blend in there. We're gonna stir that around, add some sugar, and add a couple of eggs. At that point, just get it all mixed up. Once we get that all mixed together, we're gonna put it in our dish and we're gonna bake it at 400 for about 40 minutes. You'll have to judge if you need to go a little longer, a little shorter, but the top is gonna brown up nicely and it's still gonna have a little bit of a jiggle to it underneath that because it is a pudding after all. We've got our pudding in our bowl here. Now, if you want to turn this out afterwards, you're gonna have to grease the bottom and the sides of the bowl that you bake it in. I'm just gonna dish it out, so I wasn't very concerned about that, just to let you know at home. We've got this finished and we're gonna put it in the oven. We've made this dish before on the channel. It's really fantastic. I'm excited to eat it. It's just a couple of simple ingredients and man, does it taste good. I love the texture in this. It's just creamy. You get the corn taste. There's some sugar in there that kind of complements it. It's not too sweet, but it's a dessert or a side dish. Either way you go, it's just fantastic.
Boston is at the heart of political unrest in the 1770s because of the money that Great Britain is trying to extract from the colonies to pay for the French and Indian War that happened in the 1750s and 60s. And they start to do things like the Stamp Act and other kind of taxing. And this immediately causes problems in the colonies and specifically in Boston because that's the commercial center. That's where all this commerce is coming in and out of, and that's where the taxation is happening. So this causes great political unrest. You have people like John Hancock, who has ships and merchandise, and the restriction of trade is causing him to lose money. Because of the political unrest driven by this taxation, the British go ahead and they put troops into Boston. This creates even more conflict, and we have the Boston Massacre that happens at this point. And who defends the British during the Boston Massacre? John Adams. We have these famous names in Boston that are part of the political culture that creates the Revolutionary War. After the Boston Massacre, political unrest is at an all-time high in the area, and we have Sam Adams stepping into the fray, whipping it up even more and causing the Boston Tea Party. Today we see Boston as just another great city in the United States. But in the 18th century, Boston in North America was an amazingly important center for commerce, for political thought, for religious thought, and for cultural ideas. What's happening on the dinner plates of Boston has a major cultural impact to the entire colonial era.